Okay, so thank you. Yes, it is the third time that I'm here. The reason I'm saying that it's not necessarily K Mohila Academy at the moment because I also teach at Ukrainian Catholic University in the business school, and as of March, I have become involved in something called, it's a very long name, but it's the National Agency for Higher Education Quality Assurance, which is a government agency. So the last time I was here, uh, Dominique invited me to speak about how we bridge activism and academia. And I think at this point, I've probably, as of March, made the decision to go more into activism and less perhaps into academia, but it's still involved with higher education. I'm certainly happy to talk about higher education reform if someone's interested in that, but we'll leave that certainly for questions. I've been asked to talk about the book. It was published in February of this year, so it is relatively brand new, available in North America as of September. So we're looking at something that unfortunately has not even been reviewed properly yet. So if anyone in the audience would like to write a review, I would be very grateful. And I'll say a couple of words. This is the piece that I should be using. Yes, no, I think I pressed the wrong button. Arrows at the side. Okay, there we go. So I think one of the major points that I tried to make in the book is the fact that the revolution is ongoing. I find it very problematic when we talk about the Maidan revolution as being something in the past. I think it's something that is not in the past. It's very much in the present. The academic pedigree for the book is taken very much from a fellow by the name of Crane Brinton, who is very widely read in political sciences in North America, possibly in Europe as well, because his book came out in 1938 and then has been republished 16 times. And it talks about the fact that revolutions have a life cycle, and in fact they begin with the violent overthrow of an ancien regime, and then there's a period of moderate reforms, for example, in France and in Russia, or perhaps a period of institution building in the American case, and then things sort of can end up can either go in the proper direction or can go in a very sad direction of terror and thermidor, et cetera, et cetera. But the point is that the book is trying to make a point of we are not talking about Maidan and the revolution as being something in the past, but it has a certain it's following a certain life cycle that has been well described. Unfortunately, has never been described and applied to the Ukrainian case. Um, what I'm also doing is I'm very much viewing the book through an idealist lens rather than a structural lens. So the traditional way of looking at revolutions is always about either class, or revolutions are somehow involved in geopolitics, or revolutions may be involved in the fact that people are not their material interests are not being adequately satisfied. In this case, I'm saying that this is a revolution that, like others described by Hannah Arendt, this is very much an idealist revolution, and it's about bringing in new ideas and making them into policy and making them into a way of life and practice. So three areas that I look at. One is the historical trajectory, and if we like it, it's the national dimension. The second is sort of a socioeconomic development, meaning I'm calling it bourgeois, which is probably not the best of terms to use, but nevertheless, I'm using that term, and I suppose I'll explain it in the questions, perhaps. And then I'm also talking a lot about the novelty of philosophical senses, which I think is probably the major contribution of the last 5 years, and certainly underappreciated. As you can see, in the introduction, the reason for writing the book, in fact, was first of all, as has been mentioned already, I was writing during the 2013-14 up to about 16. I was doing sort of regular both Facebook posts and email, etc., and sort of acting as a bit of a journalist, perhaps an analytical journalist, if you like, although I didn't like to call myself a journalist. The point is that many of those texts in some form or other ended up in the book. And in 15, 16, and I would actually say up to about 2017, and perhaps even to this day, Ukraine is very much considered to be sort of a territory on which a geopolitical battleground is going on. And I thought that was totally wrong, because the view of Ukraine as a battleground for geopolitics basically means that there is no agency provided to Ukrainians. And the purpose of the book, in fact, was to give voice. The series is actually called Ukrainian Voices, and the second one will be coming out, second book in that series, not mine, by Marko Cincar, will be coming in 2020. But the point is that we're trying to give voice to Ukrainians as opposed to making Ukraine an object of someone else's analysis. So I begin with a little bit less of a, if you like, analysis. I'll get into the analysis in a second. I think one of the major points that I try to make, and I do it visually through maps, is that we traditionally look at Ukraine as being divided. Certainly, this is the sort of the map of the result of the elections back in the Kuchma elections back in '94. Then we have a shift of that line under Yushchenko Yanukovych and then Timoshenko Yanukovych, and we see Ukraine as being divided that way. And in fact, if we look at it, I think that this is something that we as social scientists should keep in mind, that sometimes politicians actually believe us. In this case, Putin believed that Ukraine was in fact divided in terms of identity, because if you look at that map, the dark side of the map is effectively what Putin was expecting Novorossiya to become. So Russian speakers were supposed to be also Russian, or at least affiliated to Russia. And what we see is, as a result of the 2014 election, and this again repeats itself practically in the 2019 elections, Ukraine's regional divides need to be rethought. It's not about language anymore. And it's certainly not about identity. And this is, in fact, a huge revolution that has gone on over the last little while. Now, I'm not saying that identity issues are not important. Certainly, they are important. But they have been redefined over the last 5 years in a very different way. And language no longer determines voting pattern. Second thing that I do is I talk a little bit about the Chronicle of the War in the Donbas, again providing a few maps. This is about the original first battlefields around Slovyansk, and one of the things that was a little bit controversial in that the separatist military leaders were allowed to escape to Donetsk. But I think that one of the major points that I try to make is at the moment of the MH17 crash, the area that was actually controlled by non-Ukrainian government forces was in fact very, very small in the Donbas war. And then we have several maps that compare those things. So the point is that today's LNR, DNR, or so-called republics, they are in fact larger than what was in fact liberated by the Ukrainian army. So the result of the Minsk Accords has been in fact already a Ukrainians giving up territory. There's some interesting things with respect to those territorial changes, which I talk about in the book, and the role of Ilovaisk, the role of the Ukrainian army as it became a real fighting force. Because at the moment of the Crimean annexation in February of 2014, by all accounts, the Ukrainian army could fielded about 5,000 troops, battle-ready troops. At this point, we have about 400,000, which is a huge, huge difference. I think everybody would agree. So, moving quickly, and the analysis portion of the book talks about the national dimension, how it moved from Euromaidan to Revolution of Dignity. I think one of the good quotes that I used from some of the from one of the journalists at the time was, "In searching for Europe, we found Ukraine." This was very much about a personal identity revolution that was very much experienced en masse, and we had a crucial importance of symbolism, which is actually very, very perhaps problematic and controversial, certainly in the Western press. And one of the things that I make a point about is the idea of inclusive patriotism, which involves the contemporization of historical symbols. So Bandera is no longer the equivalent of Bandera in 1945. Just because people are using Bandera, it would be the equivalent of Americans saying that Jefferson is their hero, even though Jefferson obviously had slaves. That doesn't mean that Americans are condoning slave ownership. Same kind of concept. Just because Bandera may have had ideas that were a little bit further to the right than most of us would find comfortable, the today's patriotic resurgence requires symbolism, and very often Bandera is used as that kind of a symbol of inclusive patriotism. And very often the people that are quoting Bandera are in fact Russian speakers. I think there's a very interesting national dimension to what is going on in Ukraine, which very often from the outside is not necessarily well understood. The bourgeois dimension, which is the second aspect of the revolution that I talk about, has to do with the phenomenon of Automaidan. And a very common question that I get asked is, who financed the protesters? Because if you have protests going on in the center of Kyiv for 3 months, that requires financing. And the answer to that one is that, first of all, it wasn't students, marginalization of the students after the 1st of December. And you have this new group of people that are city dwellers, middle class, very often small, medium enterprise owners, programmers, people that have money to spare, if you like, to finance protest. And these people are also carriers of a certain ideology, and that ideology tends to be economically very right wing. When I say right wing, in this case, I don't mean national versus cosmopolitan, but rather right versus left in the traditional sense. So one of the things that we have at the moment, for example, in the Zelensky election, is a proclaimed libertarianism. So a very large proportion of that urban electorate is about sort of minimizing the state, and interestingly enough, it happens to be kind of very much against the ideas that are put forth by the European Union, where we have in the European Union we have the concept of a social market being a universalized idea, and in Ukraine today, economic policy. By the way, 73% of the people voted for this person that has proclaimed himself to be a libertarian. Now, whether 73% understood the concept of what a libertarianism is all about is another story. But the point is that the current government is very much about that sort of bourgeois dimension. The third aspect, and I'll be very brief because I know that I can see by Dominique's reaction that he's telling me I should end, and I will be very brief about it. I think the major contribution, which I think is least understood about the last 5 years and specifically what happened and what we experienced on the Maidan, was the formation of new senses. And we talk a lot about revolution of dignity, but in fact the word hedonist, and I talk about this a lot in the book, is not an equivalent. It doesn't translate well into dignity. Dignity is something that is a concept that is very much about sort of democratizing sort of status, if you like. And it's a personal idea. It's about who an individual either has dignity or doesn't have dignity. Dignity or hedonist in the Ukrainian concept is very much relational. It's about being part of a society that has dignity, that has hedonist. And it's very difficult to talk about, for example, the dignity of a nation in English, but it's certainly possible to talk about hedonist Nazi or hedonist Narodu in Ukrainian. I talk a little bit about the concept of personalism, which I think is again something that's interesting in contrast to the Western concept of individualism. Ukrainians tend to be a little bit more collectivist than Westerners in general. However, it's a certain kind of collectivism which emphasizes individual rights and collective responsibility, which is a very interesting idea. In fact, close to the ideas of if strangely enough, to Roman Catholic philosophers, specifically to John Paul II. The concept of leaderless agency and the idea of a charismatic idea. So rather than charisma of a person, the idea of the social phenomenon of an idea being something that can actually push people to do something very different and put their own lives at risk. That what I just did was a very, very, very brief sort of I guess introduction to the second half of the book, which is kind of the second half is very much the analytical portion. The book is called A Chronicle and Analysis of the Revolution of Dignity. I've tried to be analytical because I figured that this would be much more of a scholarly kind of discussion. But the first half of the book is in fact very much a sort of an emotional chronicle. Maidan was the first time where I actually saw someone die. The chap right here, he was shot. I'm taking this picture. He was shot. I was about 5 meters away from me. He was picking up some debris on the Maidan and was shot. That was a very emotional occurrence. Obviously, when you see thousands of people standing in front of a building, actually, I would say hundreds of thousands of people standing in front of a building that has just been burned out, and people that have been burned alive inside, that kind of leaves some effects on you. And I do mention my kids a lot in the book because they went through a significant amount of I think changes, and I talk about wide-eyed patriotism because I think this is really their response. This is a picture from their school. So on the right we have Sushko Plekhanov, who was a former student at my kid's school, who is one of the members of the Heavens 100 and the Best Sotnya. We went through something that was, I would say, on the one hand, I talk about this. It's a roller coaster ride of emotions. On the one hand, this was terror. This was depression. This was at the same time, and it was a very strange emotional thing to live through. On the one hand, you're terrorized and you're depressed because you see people around you that are in absolute grave danger and death. And at the same time, you realize that there's something going on that is the effective birth of something absolutely fantastic and new. And I would say that this is the moment when we really felt humanity. Um, I will caution that that is ongoing, and any calls for peace uh, need to be tempered, in fact, with something that is very emotional and very raw still in most Ukrainians. Um, we have approximately 400,000 veterans in our country that have experienced combat. My kids have parents, have friends in their classrooms whose parents have been are missing limbs, are missing various aspect or missing eyes, missing limbs, and psyches that have been traumatized. This is very much alive, and the purpose of the book was to try to bring some of that emotional aspect, and if you like, of the agency of Ukrainians and what we've lived through over 5 years, to an English language reader. How well I've been able to do that, I guess, is up to you guys to decide. So thanks for listening.